Hello, I'm Madison Beal, and today I have the privilege of interviewing Colonel John Dickson. He served 30 years in the United States Army in places like Berlin, Vietnam, West Point, and Turkey. Although he began in the infantry, he served most of his time as an intelligence officer. But today I thought we could focus on his time served in Berlin, Germany. Okay, so let's begin with when did you first come to Germany?
I actually first came to Germany when I was 11 years old. My father was a cavalry officer patrolling the border between East Germany and West Germany. We lived there for about 3 years. At that age, I really didn't appreciate the significance of being so close to the Iron Curtain.
So then, when did you come to Berlin?
I came to Berlin in 1965. I was a brand new second lieutenant, fresh out of Texas A&M. I was an infantry officer, and Berlin at the time was already the focus of world attention, and I can't exaggerate how exciting it was to arrive there and to be a part of what was going on.
So, what was Berlin like in 1965?
Well, the wall had gone up in 1961, August 13th, 1961, and from that time on, the first 4 years of the wall, things had been exciting every day, every night in the city. There was tension everywhere you went. It, at the same time, was an exciting city because it was already growing. West Berlin was trying to become a modern place to live. It was fascinating because they had some strange things left over from the war. For example, downtown Berlin was still, in some parts around where Hitler's bunker was still leveled. It was in rubble from the intense bombing that had happened there. Out in the neighborhoods, it was a beautiful city, but every so often you would have a bombed out building. This was because the Germans had a rule that said that you had 25 years from 1945 to claim your building, or the city would take over and clean it out. Well, in the case of a bombed out building, that meant that the family was not there anymore, and nobody had stepped forward to claim it before the 25 years was up. So you'd come through a beautiful neighborhood and there'd be nice house, bombed out building. And this was everywhere. The city itself was a center of espionage. There's no doubt about it. The Russians, the East Germans, even the communist Chinese, everybody was there trying to spy on each other, trying to find out weaknesses, trying to get people to spy for them. And it was a part of our life, a way of our life. It was just a very exciting time, but a very, very tense time. Our first apartment there, where we lived, was only 6 blocks from the wall. And so every night we could sit on our patio and hear the shooting of machine guns, AK-47s, as East Germans tried to get across that part of the wall and escape into West Germany. I would say we probably had a successful escape every third or fourth night that we were there. The people would use all sorts of ways to get across the border. They would hide up in the fender of a car so that they couldn't be seen. In one case, a family took a bulldozer and armor plated it, got the whole family, children and everyone, inside the armor plated box and just pushed their way through the wall. When they got the bulldozer over to the west, it had like 300 bullet holes in it, but the family survived. In another case, the janitor in a building that was adjacent to the wall brought his family in during the day and hid them in a closet. After everyone went home, he threw a rope across the wall from about the 5th floor. Someone on the other side grabbed the rope and pulled it tight, and the entire family did the slide for life across the wall while the East German soldiers walked along below them, not knowing it was happening. This sort of thing was happening every night, and so it was just a very, very exciting, very tense place to be. You felt as if you were at the focus of the world, and we were. We certainly were.
Okay, so why was the tension so high in Berlin?
Well, it was because so many world powers were focusing their effort to compete with one another in one small geographic location. I think that's really the reason. The Soviet Union wanted us out of Berlin. The East Germans wanted us out of Berlin. The Western powers, the United States, United Kingdom, Great Britain, and the French, wanted to hold on to Berlin as a indication of our solidarity behind the West German people, the German people. And so this competition between the world powers caused just a ton of tension to be focused right there in Berlin. As time went by, the economy of East Germany failed miserably. The productivity was nil. The quality of their products were nil. Their money was valueless, and they were leaving East Germany as fast as they could, trying to get across the border, the boundary, into West Germany or into West Berlin. By 1961, over 20% of the East German population had escaped to the West. It was at that point that the East German government decided they had to do something drastic, and they began building the wall, the infamous Wall of Berlin. It was erected on August 13, 1961, and it at first caused even more immigration from the east to the west, as people realized that they'd better get out quickly before this wall is complete. From 1961 to 1965, when we arrived, tension was all along this wall and in all places in West Berlin, because these people trying to escape, because of the East Germans and the Soviets trying to find them and bring them back in some cases. And so it was just a very, very tense place to be.
Did you ever go into East Germany or East Berlin?
Well, I did, although it was on a very limited basis in some cases. The four powers that defeated the Nazis met at Potsdam after the war to decide how they were going to manage Germany. And when they divided up the country, they agreed that the armed forces from the four powers would have free access into all of Germany if they followed certain rules. They had always had to be in uniform. They had to come only at certain times. And as a result, we were relatively free to go into East Berlin, for example, if I was in Class A uniform, and if I had a set of orders that authorized me to go through Checkpoint Charlie. Checkpoint Charlie, by the way, was the street on Friedrichstrasse where the authorized movement between the American sector and the Russian sector was authorized. I went frequently into East Berlin to simply maintain that access to prevent the Soviets and the East Germans from assuming that we're not doing that access anymore, and as a result they could cut us off if we hadn't done it. I'd actually go on what was called a patrol into East Berlin, be myself and three soldiers in an army sedan. We'd go through Checkpoint Charlie. We would have a list of targets that we had to hit in East Berlin. Most of them were Soviet Army bases, tank and armored infantry bases, East German Army bases, some government facilities, and we had to go to each one of them. And we spent 4 hours in East Berlin taking detailed notes as to what we saw and what we heard. For example, we were very alert to watch for tank movements because there was one tank battalion, the Soviet Army, in East Berlin. And anytime you move tanks, that means something is happening. And so we'd check the tank battalion barracks every time we went over. They had a huge high wall. We never saw anything inside, but we knew to patrol around it. And sometimes in the middle of the night, we would see along the roadway out of East Berlin road guards of the Soviet Army, and that meant that there was going to be a convoy of tanks come by, and we'd park in the bushes and watch for the tanks to go by, count them, see if they had any new tanks, identify any new equipment, We weren't allowed to have cameras, and so we had to take everything in detailed notes, and then go back after our 4-hour patrol, write up the report, and send it into the brigade headquarters. That could cause some excitement because in the same sense, the East Germans and the Soviets didn't want us to watch their tanks, didn't want us to come around and look at their barracks. And so there were times when if we pulled up in front of a East German barracks building, I recall a East German sergeant coming out and banging on the window next to me and telling me in German in very unkind words to move along and get out of the way. One night, middle of the night, we thought we were going to see tanks because we saw the road guards out on the road, and my sergeant and I pulled the vehicle off in a park near it so we could watch everything go by. And what we didn't know was that there were some security guys following us. They pulled up real quickly behind us, covered our sedan with blankets so that we couldn't see anything. And for 2 hours we sat there and listened to the tanks go by and counted them that way by sound. Couldn't tell what kind of tank it was, but they accomplished their purpose of preventing us from seeing it, but we still accomplished our mission of counting the tanks. Afterwards they pulled the blankets off and we went back to Checkpoint Charlie and went home. Spent a lot of time in East Berlin doing that. The last time I went in was on August 13, 1966, which was the 5th anniversary of the wall. And I went in on foot, in uniform, for the purpose of watching a East German parade. It was considered the anniversary or the celebration of the industrial armed forces of the East German Army. And each factory had like a reserve platoon in each factory, and they came marching by, and they marched for, it seemed like a long, long time. And as the parade went on, though, they would stop and have to wait for the guys in front of them to move on, and people would come out and bring them a beer or two. And by the time we got to the end of the parade, the units were really not marching very well. But I remember that parade because I stood at one point next to an East German officer. He was a lieutenant of the security guards police, the Stasi. It's like, and he was exactly like his father's SS. The uniform was the same from World War II. He had a dagger in his boots, just like an SS officer would have. And I stood next to him throughout the speech by the East German Prime Minister, Walter Ulbricht. Walter Ulbricht spoke for an hour and a half, and it was the hottest day in the history of Berlin. When he got to about the 30-minute mark, he'd stop for applause, and people would clap like mad, and then he'd start up again. And as it went longer and longer, the East Germans would moan and groan every time he started talking again, because it went on and on. An hour and a half in that heat was miserable. But this lieutenant from the Stasi would give everybody the evil eye if he saw them moaning and groaning. And so you saw this little aura of people around him who supported the speech wholeheartedly, while everybody else down the street protested the fact that Walter Ulbricht was talking too long.
Okay, so did you have any specific dealings with the East German Army?
Officially, we had no dealings with the East German Army because it was the policy of the United States that the East German government and its army were invalid, and we did not recognize them. For example, if I walked up on an East German colonel, I would not salute him, even though there were times when he would ask for a salute or be upset if I didn't. So officially, we didn't have any dealings with the East German government or army. I mentioned before, though, the East German sergeant banged on my window. That was not an unusual event. That happened quite often. But we were given specific instructions not to deal with them if they tried to intercede and take the role of the Soviet officers that we were supposed to deal with. When we came to the checkpoint, Checkpoint Charlie or Checkpoint Bravo down on the Autobahn, we had to deal with a Soviet officer. if an East German officer was the only guy there, we ignored him. And so officially we had no dealings with them, and it irritated them to great lengths.
So you talked about your dealings with the East German Army. Did you have any dealings with the Soviet Army?
Not a lot either there, although we could have if it was necessary. We had some very common contact with them when I would go in uniform over to East Germany and go to the to the Soviet PX to buy Russian goods. I remember buying my wife a pair of Russian boots, fur-lined boots, and there was a Soviet colonel there who didn't like the idea that I was buying boots. Because our money was so much more valuable than theirs, it was very easy for us to go over and buy things. I was just a second lieutenant. He was an old grizzly colonel from World War II, and he took offense to it, but nothing more than to say a few words under his breath about us being there. When we went through through the Autobahn to West Germany, we had to go through checkpoint Bravo, and there was a Soviet colonel there that we had to deal with if we were the convoy commander. But it was very official, very cold, very specific. He had been there in that job since World War II, and so he was a very interesting fellow. I would have loved to have talked to him more, but we never got the chance.
So what were some of the more memorable Cold War crises that you experienced in Berlin?
It seemed as if every 3 or 4 months we were having a crisis of some sort or another because of this tension that happened in Berlin. The most memorable one, I think, was what became known as the Firebar crash. On April 6, 1966, in the middle of the night, a Soviet fighter airplane crashed into a lake in West Berlin. The police reported the crash of an airplane into the water. No one was seen surviving. The Soviets immediately asked for access to their airplane, said it was a trainer that had run out of gas, and they wanted to retrieve the aircraft themselves. We were immediately suspicious because they were too energetic in their desire to get to the airplane. It was up in the British sector of Berlin where the Brits controlled the lake. The Brits put a scuba diver down and found that it was a brand new, never before seen fighter interceptor complete with radar and electronics that we had never seen before, called the Yak-28 Firebar. We continued to keep the Soviets out of West Berlin for that time, giving them, made-up reasons for not being able to come in. And while we delayed them, and it was about 18 hours, I guess, the Brits took the airplane out of the water, took it to a hangar, completely dissected it, photographed it, analyzed it, put it back in the water, and then only then did we allow the Soviets to come in and retrieve their airplane. As a result of that, we had all of the details of their brand new radar, their brand new electronic countermeasures, and as a result, the Yak-28 was never produced in numbers beyond about the first 10 or 12 airplanes. They realized it had been compromised, and the quick action of the Brits and the quick action of American MPs at Checkpoint Charlie not to allow the Soviets in made that happen. That was one of the fun things because I was, at that time, brigade operations officer, and I got a call in the middle of the night from my general saying, "John, come in. Do you have a plan for what happens when a Russian jet crashes in West Germany or West Berlin?" Of course, I didn't have a plan for that because I never thought of that happening, but we made a plan real quickly. There were other interesting things. There were times when the East Germans would try to encroach the border and move it a little bit closer in towards us, move the wall in places closer than they are allowed to, and we'd protest it, and they'd answer back and ignore our protest. It was real exciting for me because I was still a lieutenant, but I was writing letters for my general, the boss, to send back to the ambassador in Bonn, to the Secretary of State, Dean Russ, to the Secretary of Defense, McNamara, and even into President Lyndon Johnson's office, saying what we were going to do and how we were going to handle that. Little did I know 2 or 3 years before, when I was taking college English, that I was going to be writing letters like that, and it caused some excitement on my part. At one point, though, we realized how international affairs go. We were talking about how we would counter the East German encroachment, and we got word back from the White House: do what you want to do, but don't do it on Saturday, because that's when Lyndon Johnson's daughter is going to get married on the White House lawn, and we don't want to have any crisis during the wedding. And so we didn't do anything that Saturday. We worried about it on Monday. But it was there were a lot of little things like that on a daily basis almost that just made our life exciting, made it a fun place to be. One other interaction with the Soviet Army, and in fact with Soviet soldiers that we had, involved guarding what was called Spandau Prison. When the Nuremberg trials finished, 9 of the Nazis that were tried at the Nuremberg trials were given prison sentences, and they were sent to a prison in West Berlin called Spandau Prison. There were 9 of them. Most of them had 10-year sentences, 20-year sentences. They were peripherally involved with the atrocities that the Nazis committed, and as a result, they weren't given very serious sentences, but they had to be imprisoned. The 4 powers, the Soviets, the British, the French, and the United States, ran the prison. It was an old political prison that had been run by the Kaiser in early 20th century. It was an ancient building, but they only had 9 prisoners there at the beginning. By the time I came along in 1965, there were only 3 prisoners there. But each month, one of the Allied powers would take charge of the prison and provide the 40 guards that had to run the prison. My battalion had it in December, and we gave it on January 1st every year to a Soviet platoon of 40 guys, and they came and guarded the prison for January, and it rotated around. The prisoners that were there were interesting because one of them was Rudy Hess, the guy who flew a Messerschmitt into Scotland in 1941, thinking that he might negotiate peace with the Brits, even though he didn't ask Hitler's permission to do that. He was a little loony even in 1941. By the time I guarded him in 1965, he was totally that way. The other 2 prisoners were Baldur von Schirach, who had been head of the Hitler Youth, and Adolf Speer, who had been the architect who designed all of the buildings in Berlin, and who also managed the German manufacturing effort that fed the war effort. Speer and von Schirach were young men when they were sentenced. Rudy Hess was old and decrepit already when he was sentenced. So when I guarded them, I got a chance to be in the exercise area where the 3 Nazis were exercised every day. Speer and von Schirach would exercise very vigorously in this small 20-yard by 20-yard garden. Hess would go to his bench and sit with his cane and draw drawings in the sand until the 30 minutes were up, and then he would go back into his cell. It was a very interesting experience for me to see these guys and to see how they were living now 20 years after their time as Nazis. Speer and von Schirach were released right after I was officer of the guard in '67, I guess it was. Rudy Hess, though, was a lifer. He had to stay in prison for life, and the Soviets would not release him. They feared that he might be one of those that could be the catalyst for a 4th Reich, and the Soviets were absolutely adamant that that wasn't going to happen. And so they made us run this entire prison with all these guards and all these cooks and all these doctors and nurses for one guy until Rudy died. I believe it was in the 70s, although there is a lot of controversy about whether or not he died or the Soviets bumped him off, assassinated him. And you can find a couple of books on the shelf about Rudy Hess and his ultimate fate. That was an exciting. To be honest, it was a difficult duty that we had to pull and not enjoyed at the time. But looking back on it, it was a part of history to guard the three Nazis and then to give up the guard to a Soviet platoon. One of the things we did when we gave up the guard, every time you had that change of guard ceremony, the 44 soldiers that you had to be 6 feet or taller, no spectacles, and reasonably handsome was what the criteria were. And you see these pictures of the changing of the guard. The Soviets couldn't come up with 44 guys who were 6 feet or taller. And so you kind of get this idea of a Cold War confrontation of we're taller, better looking, and we can see a lot better than you are.
So did you ever go back to Berlin?
I actually did. I've been back 3 times. The first time was in 1988, just before the Soviet Union collapsed, East Germany collapsed and imploded, and just before the wall came down. Berlin was still just as exciting, just as tense, and you could feel the tension rising. I'd gotten some briefings there. Went up to Checkpoint Charlie, went up to the Brandenburg Gate, which is where the wall crosses along there, just to see how things were after all those years. And they were still very much the same. Not as many people trying to come across, but you could feel that East Germany was sort of vibrating, sort of quaking with an oncoming storm. I went back again in about 10 years after the wall fell. And it was a totally different city. Some of the markings were still the same, some of the features were still the same, but the wall had come down. East Germany was now a part of Germany. The wall was, of course, gone. They had, in its place, made a brick marker in the streets and along the curbs or wherever the wall had been so that you could follow the trace of the wall all the way from the north, all the way down to the southern end of the wall. And I took advantage of that and walked casually across Checkpoint Charlie and then down Friedrichstrasse and where people had been shot at during my time and died. And I knew that things had changed when about 100 yards through Checkpoint Charlie in the eastern, what would have been East Berlin on Friedrichstrasse, there was a Starbucks. And so that told me that times were changing. I got to tell you, though, I went deep into East Berlin and still saw some of the same things that I saw before. The buildings were decrepit and falling apart still. The streets were not very attractive. Cars were not very well kept. And you could see a difference in the people. I talked to one East German who said he wished for the old days because now he's maybe a free person, a free man, but he has to work 2 hours for a loaf of bread. Before, he didn't have to work at all for his loaf of bread. And I thought that this guy is going to have a very difficult time fitting into West German economic endeavors because he has a very different attitude that was developed in the 50 years or so that the East German government existed. But it was certainly a different place to be. It lost a lot of its excitement after the wall came down. And we've been back there since and found that it's just a modern European city with a lot of immigrants, and only a slight memory of the tension that used to be there.